Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Translation Across Disciplines Conference. If you've registered and haven't yet received a name tag, please grab one from the back from Kirsty and Jill. Thanks, Kirsty and Jill in the back. We are ready to set. We had a great day yesterday, and we're looking forward to all the wonderful presentations today. Thanks for coming.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Michelle Clayton. I'm an Associate Professor in Hispanic Studies and Comparative Literature. It's my pleasure to be moderating this panel on scholarly translation this morning. Welcome to you all. I'll introduce each of our presenters very briefly and refer you, as always, to the website for more information. So our first presenter is Kevin McLaughlin, who is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Brown. He's the former Dean of the Faculty, and he's the current Director of the new John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study at Brown.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to offer some words about translation project, editing translation project on which I'm collaborating with my colleague Susan Bernstein from Brown, who will speak after me. We'll each speak to different parts of this project. And our colleague at Northwestern University, Peter Fenves. Can't hear me? Can't hear me? Yeah, it seems like it's echoing though. So the volume is called, I think they turned it up now, Walter Benjamin, Writings on Goethe. And as this title states, it selects, edits, and translates into English Benjamin's writings on Goethe, starting in 1916 and 1917 with a draft of a review, unpublished in Benjamin's lifetime, of Friedrich Gundolf's study of Goethe, through the appendix to Benjamin's dissertation on German Romanticism in 1919, his essay on Goethe's elective affinities, completed in 1922, his article on Goethe, prepared for the Great Soviet Encyclopedia in the late 1920s, through his Arcades project, left unfinished at his death in 1940. Benjamin's work started to appear in English translations in the 1960s, most prominently with the collection titled Illuminations that was edited and introduced by his friend Hannah Arendt, and a second collection prepared by Peter Demetz under the title of Reflections. Then, beginning in the second half of the 1990s, Harvard University Press launched its Selected Writings project under the editorship of Michael Jennings. Selected Writings, which eventually ran to 4 volumes and was published from 1996 to 2003, along with the massive Arcades project in 1999, of which I was the co-translator. This produced a vastly larger selection of Benjamin's work in English and contributed to the true explosion of interest in Benjamin's critical work across the remarkably wide range of topics and disciplines on which his work touched. The 4 volumes of Selected Writings and the single-volume Arcades project include translations of many of the texts that are included in our volume, Writings on Goethe. However, our approach differs from the one that informs the Selected Writings volumes. While the Harvard Press volumes have published a selection of texts largely chronologically, we have tried to select, edit, translate, retranslate, and annotate Benjamin's extant writings on Goethe over more than 2 decades in a way that makes it possible for the English reader to discern the outlines and direction of a distinct and remarkable critical project on Goethe that spans Benjamin's entire literary corpus. This involves crucially translating as consistently as possible Benjamin's terminology, which is extraordinarily important to his critical project, in order to make visible the line of argument threading its way through these texts. And yet, it also sometimes requires that we depart from this consistency in translation. Today, I just very briefly will give one illustration of this point with regard to Benjamin's essay on Goethe's elective affinities, for which I was chiefly responsible, before turning things over to my colleague Susan Bernstein, who will comment on the essay on Goethe that was prepared for the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, for which she was chiefly responsible. My comments will center on the difficulties posed by the terms that Benjamin introduces at the very beginning of his essay on Goethe's elective affinities, namely the German terms Sachgehalt and Wahrheitsgehalt, and yoking them together, the key word Gehalt. Oh, I should have done this. This is my one slide. Not very elaborate. I'll be I wanted to keep this up here while I was talking so you could see the words, and also the example I'm going to give you at the end will draw on this little diagram. In this case, bringing to light the trajectory and structure of the argument emerging in Benjamin's writings on Goethe required that we diverge from our general principle of translating key terms with consistency. The word Gehalt is based on the verb halten, which means to hold. Gehalt is thus that which holds or that which is held. The entry for Gehalt in the second section of Volume 4 of Grimm's dictionary that appeared in 1897 begins with precisely this distinction between what it describes as active and passive significations of the word. In Benjamin's dissertation on German Romanticism, which immediately preceded his essay on Goethe, the term Gehalt emerges in quotations from Johann Gottlieb Fichte, where it can be accurately translated as content. That is to say, in the passive sense of that which is contained. For Fichte, according to Benjamin, the form of thinking becomes its content. That's the innovation of Fichte's philosophy, according to Benjamin, the post-Kantian developments. This is the formula reinterpreted by the Romantics, according to Benjamin, in their concept of the work of art in which thinking oscillates between form and content rather than simply being contained in it. But Gehalt enters into a different configuration in Goethe's work, as Benjamin begins to argue in the appendix to the dissertation, and as he elaborates more fully in his study of elective affinities. With respect to Goethe, Gehalt is taken up in relation not to form or the idea of form, in the case of the Romantics, but to the ideal of art, its a priori condition of possibility. With Goethe's later work, Benjamin proposes, there is a new approach to Gehalt. It is not understood in relation to form, and so it is not content. It is not what is contained in the work of art. This is what Benjamin carefully designates as Inhalt, but rather what is prior to it. Gehalt is in this sense the cause of the work, or the a priori condition of possibility of the work. The Gehalt of the work is what decomposes as what Benjamin calls Sachgehalt, the slide there, Sachgehalt and Wahrheitsgehalt, the decomposition that constitutes the history of the work of art, according to Benjamin. Because this decomposing Gehalt is not contained in, but rather is prior to the work of art, it should not be translated as content, but rather we propose as matter, Gehalt as matter. Thus, we have translated it as matter, and we have translated Sachgehalt and Wahrheitsgehalt, respectively, as subject matter and truth of the matter. This allows us to produce the translation of the opening sentences of Benjamin's essay on Goethe's elective affinities, with which I will close as follows. These are the first sentences of the essay. The existing writings on literary works suggest that the level of detail in such investigations owes more to philological than to critical interest. The following exposition of elective affinities, which also goes into some detail, could therefore easily be misleading as to the intention with which it is given. This is the key sentence. It could appear as commentary. It is meant, however, as critique. Critique seeks the truth of the matter with regard to an artwork. Commentary, its subject matter. Close quote. Thank you very much.
today is Susan Bernstein, who is professor of German. I'm sorry, I don't know if you heard the first part of that. Our second speaker today is Susan Bernstein, professor of German and comparative literature at Brown.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks to Jane Sokolowski for organizing this wonderful conference and to everyone else who helped organize it. Can you hear me now? No. How's that? Okay. So thank you, Kevin, especially for introducing our project. So I'm going to speak a little bit about Benjamin's, Benjamin's article written for the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. It was with göttlicher Frechheit, or divine impudence, that Benjamin accepted the assignment to write an article on Goethe for the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, quote, from the point of view of Marxist doctrine, unquote. He announced this to Gershom Scholem in a letter dated April 5th, 1926. He mused that the task could, as much as any other, provide an opportunity for improvisation, but it was a task that he found at once, quote, impossible and contradictory, unquote. Despite the doctrinaire nature of the assignment, Benjamin exclaims to Scholem, God knows I can't be counted on for a system, exclamation point, of materialism. He was meant to give a Marxist materialist interpretation of the German poet for a Soviet audience. So there's a question of whether Benjamin's work was taking a different turn by the time he got to this Soviet article. But in what should a materialist account of Goethe consist? Perhaps in a representation, an image of the poet's life. And indeed, the article begins with Goethe's birth date and follows his life through major life events, amorous partners and marriage, official positions, composition of works. Would Benjamin himself thus indulge in what he calls the proton pseudos of criticism, that is, the effort to read the work through the life? Was this perhaps the contradiction in which he became immersed in the aftermath of his essay, Goethe's Elective Affinities? In a letter to Hugo von Hofmannsthal, October 30th, 1926, Benjamin writes, one sees what such books have lost with the organization in the sense of reference works, how the indisputable requirements of newer scientific technique are incompatible with gaining an eidos, an image of life. This remark suggests the inherent contradiction Benjamin points to in the writing of the article Goethe. He continues, true, it would seem to me to be almost a miracle if I should succeed in giving an image of Goethe in a relatively short space that would capture the current Russian readers. In principle, however, it seems to me not only possible, but also most fruitful, unquote. In the Moscow Diary, Benjamin is subtly critical of the proliferation of images he encounters there. He writes, quote, the cult of Lenin's image in particular is taken to incredible lengths here. There's a store on the Kuznetsky Most that specializes in Lenin, and he comes in every size, pose, and material. He goes on to describe a variety of images in various places, indeed, not unlike the various representations of Goethe one finds today in the many shops in Weimar, Germany. It is perhaps just such an image that one of the editors of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia required of Benjamin. Benjamin describes his encounter with this young editor in the Moscow Diary. Quote, as I outlined the scheme of my Goethe to him, his intellectual insecurity immediately became evident. There were a number of things in my proposal that intimidated him, and he finally ended up recommending a biographical portrait, a Lebensbild, against a sociological background. Here, Benjamin flatly rejects the notion of criticism as the presentation of an image or eidos of a life. Quote, but it is fundamentally impossible to do a materialist depiction of a writer's life. One can only show its historical after effects, Nachwirkung. In fact, if abstracted from its posterity, its Nachleben, an artist's existence and even his purely temporal oeuvre can offer no object whatsoever for materialist analysis, unquote. The portrait of the man gives way to the fading aura of his historical afterlife. This anonymous young editor was not the only one to disapprove of Benjamin's scheme for his encyclopedia article. Benjamin recounts his visit to the encyclopedia office with Bernhard Reich, a writer and critic with whom Benjamin was close during his 2-month stay in Moscow. The senior editor, Karl Radek, memorably criticizes the scheme. Quote, "The phrase class conflict occurs 10 times on every page. Reich pointed out that this was not the case and said that it is impossible to deal with Goethe's impact, which had taken place during a period of intense class conflict without using the term. Radek, quote, "The point is to introduce it at the right moment," unquote. In the wake of this, the chances that the piece will be accepted are extremely slim. So this is still Benjamin from the Moscow Diary. "The wretched directors of this project are far too insecure to permit themselves any possibility of a personal opinion," unquote. Benjamin proceeds to tell about the expose to his friend Asya Lakis, who is partially responsible for his visit to Moscow. She at first finds fault in Benjamin's presentation. The future of the article was indeed ill-fated. Benjamin foresees this in a letter dated 30th of October, 1928, in which he sends Scholem his Goethe, quote, "who in the shape in which he comes before your lucky eyes will probably never see the light of day either in Russia or in Germany." It was never, unquote. It was never published in the form of the 2 typescripts of it, with Benjamin's corrections and additions that are in the Benjamin archive. These 2 typescripts are the basis of the text in the collected works, which we translated. A set of excerpts marked out in the 2nd transcript were published as Goethe's Politics and View of Nature in the Literarische Welt in December 1928. A Russian version was published in 1929, attributing it to 5 further Russian authors. The notes to Goethe in the collected works reprints the evaluation of Wolfgang Kazak, who compared the typescript to the published Russian text, suggesting that only 12% of the printed Russian text bears any relation to Benjamin's original. The Russian text contains more concrete dates in Goethe's life and work. Kazak reports, quote, "Decisive for the difference is the fundamentally different intellectual conception to which, above all, the interpretation of individual works and Benjamin's attempt to illuminate Goethe's particularity as a poet and as a human being fell victim. Everything essential of Walter Benjamin's expression has been eliminated." The essential quality of Benjamin's approach to Goethe, then, was excised from its Russian publication, perhaps to resurface soon afterwards in some of the short texts that follow in our translation. The short text Weimar gives a counterpoint to the encyclopedia article. When Benjamin sent it to Scholem in February 1929, he wrote that, quote, "that it presents most endearingly the side of my Janus face turned away from the Soviet state." Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker will be Kayama Glover, who is Professor of African American Studies and French at Yale University.
Do you have the remote? Do you have the remote?
I don't. I think they're bringing me the computer itself.
Are you just going to give her the computer?
Am I able to? This is now on. I'm DJing between the PowerPoint and the thingy. Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me? All right, so I'm doing a hard thing, so bear with me. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Michelle. Thank you, Jane, for putting together this conference. Thank you all for being here early this morning, and thank you, Brown, for hosting us in this very intimidating space. I am honored to be a part of this aspirationally quadrennial celebration of translation and delighted to be in conversation with all of you. So I thought I'd begin this quick presentation by offering some context for my most recent translation project, which you see up there. My PowerPoint is purely decorative. I just wanted you all to have something to look at while I'm talking, aside from me. So Popa Singer is a novel by the Haitian author René de Pestre, and it's coming out in just a few weeks. After some context, I'll read briefly to give you a sense of what my English rendering of Depestre's very particular French is like. So as with most of my translation projects, most of them are actually Haitian French to English, and I've also done some nonfiction. Taking on Popa Singer was born of my twinned and inextricable desire to better understand and to better teach both a text and its context, a particular work of literature, a particular history, and of course a particular world out of which that literature emerged. I'm a scholar and professor of Franco-Creolophone Caribbean literature with a special interest in 20th century Haiti. I'm geekily attached to close reading and textual analysis, but of course also very much concerned with the historical and social conditions of the texts that I study and teach. I'm also currently at work on a biography of this author, René Depestre. There are many truly extraordinary moments in the life of this figure, René Depestre. Hold on, that's not him. That's him. That's kind of a very indicative portrait of what he is and is like. He is a former socialist militant, novelist, essayist, and erotic poet. He's turning 98 this year. We share a birthday in August. He ping-ponged back and forth across the Atlantic and into the furthest reaches of the Cold War world, from his birthplace in Haiti to France to Czechoslovakia, Italy, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Cuba, with brief sojourns in Austria, Algeria, China, Vietnam, and Russia in the space of about 40 years, from 1945 to 86. Among the many notable episodes in this truly bananas trajectory, there's these tragicomic 13 months Depestre spends in Haiti, 11 years after having been kicked out of the country at the age of 19 in the aftermath of a revolutionary uprising that he and a few friends of his from college initiated in 1946, and that resulted in the ousting of a dictator, which is a story for another time, but is, clearly very fascinating. But in any case, after spending more than a decade wandering the globe in pursuit of genuine socialist revolution, so from 1945 to about 1956, Depestre made his way back to Haiti on the invitation of his old family doctor. That family doctor is François Papa Doc Duvalier, who had just become president of the country in 1957. He'd taken power, in fact, in the wake of the military government that had been in place since that 1946 revolution, right? So there was some room for optimism or cause for optimism for Depestre in 1957. He thought he'd go back to his homeland after this more than a decade of exile, because by that time he had already been run out of more countries than most people visit in a lifetime. And he was optimistic about Haiti's future. But of course, history has shown us just how unwarranted that optimism was. Duvalier turned out to be a far cry from the benevolent caregiver to the poor that Depestre had known as an adolescent. Within weeks of his arrival in Haiti in late 1957, Depestre saw clearly where Duvalier was headed, and after months of being surveilled and harassed, he escaped to Cuba, where he would then spend the next 20 years as a prominent actor in Castro's socialist regime before falling afoul of that government and being extracted by the UN to France, which is, again, another story. But in any event, Popa Singer, right, so back to PowerPoint. Popa Singer is a chronicle of that one dangerous year that Depestre spent living in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, from 1957 to the beginning of 1959. Those early days of Duvalierism, it's an autofictional tour de force that paints a portrait of Depestre's intimate experience of Duvalierist violence, while also laying out the grim backdrop of the wider political events of 1957-1958. In the present of the story, the protagonist and narrator, Richard Dick Denizen, which is a thinly veiled proxy for Depestre himself, bears horrified witness to the initial makings of Duvalier's state. What's incredible about this novel is that it's one of the very few narratives, fictional or other, that grapples with that so particular moment in Haiti's history, the run-up to Duvalier's brutal dictatorship. So there's this window between 57 and 61 where Duvalier declares himself president for life, where the writing was kind of on the wall, but the kind of Cold War atmosphere meant that most places were turning their eye away from that particular problem because he had pledged to keep communists out of that part of the Caribbean, right? So there was this excuse that he had for committing human rights abuses more broadly, but obviously we can't get into that. But because it's this rare window into that moment, Popa Singer is a very special book. And it was also a very special book to translate. Stylistically, it is a wild ride, and translating it often truly felt like madness of the best kind. just to give you a sense of what it looks like, there is no capitalization other than proper names for the most part. There are these giant paragraphs of swirling prose that, as often as not, don't actually end with a sentence, like a full sentence. So I'll talk a little bit about what it was like to translate that, why De Pestre wrote it in that way, and then I'm going to, as I said, read a little bit. So formally, Popasinger can be read as what's called a l'audience. That's a Creole term related to the French word audience, in English, audience, and it's a uniquely Haitian mode of oral storytelling. It uses humor to transmit an urgent lesson or to provide critical insight about a political or social situation. It's designed to convey local knowledge and to offer moral guidance to members of the community, teaching as it entertains, or entertaining as it teaches. Anchored in both Vodou and the Creole language, the l'audience is highly metaphorical and relies on proverbial wisdom. The original register of the l'audience is performance, and as its name implies, it requires the presence of an audience. So it is that from the very start, De Pestre's narrator literally calls out to us as readers. The first line, you can see that up in the upper left corner, the first line is, "Hey there, my friends, mes amis, oh." It then spins outward in pure and unbounded linguistic indulgence, clearly enchanted by its own verbal prowess. And this fundamental orality and the complexity of De Pestre's swirling creolized French really presented me with a breathtaking challenge as a translator. With its unpredictable shifts in temporality and its sudden interpolations of the reader, the story often takes off in all directions before resolving into anything resembling like a sentence or a paragraph or a completed thought. And so in bringing this work into the Anglosphere, I tried to highlight its extraordinary aesthetic innovation. I took care to align my practice with what I understand to be De Pestre's intentions regarding transparency and opacity. I hewed as closely as possible to the particularities of his prose. My translation avoids clarifying or smoothing out the elements of the title that baffled me as a reader of French, those moments in the text that slowed me down or brought me to a full stop even. I wanted to preserve that feeling of disorientation in the English reader's encounter with the novel, that disorientation that's meant also mimetically to express the disorientation of living under Duvalier's Haiti in this kind of crazy moment in 1958. So through excess, repetition, never-ending lists, and words that matter as much for their sound and their rhythm as for their meaning, Popasinger reminds us to be listeners. It clamors to be read aloud, loudly even. And so if you'll indulge me another few minutes, I'm gonna finish by reading a bit from the prelude, which you see in pieces here, which were photographed by my daughter yesterday and sent to me on her cell phone, so that's why it looks like that. So here we go. Hey there, my friends. That big boy of hers was born feet first and under a lucky star. Ladies and gentlemen, and all others gathered here, just have a look at this, if you would. Right here on this third of a Caribbean island, was it really a good idea to come into the world head wrapped in a caul and feet first like on one's last day on this earth? Thanks be to St. Philip and St. James the Major all the same. Having survived the journey safe and sound, mother and son will now be able to experience the frenzied time of past and future. The offspring from this side of the Caribbean Sea will ask a great deal of the compass rose of his marine animal's journey. His never-before-seen emergence from the natal melodrama of his birth will only be comparable to the lumberjack's effort that birthing him cost every muscle of the maternal womb. The black man who planted him in there, did he have any idea that he'd set her up to carry for a full 9 months the seed of a lifelong runaway horse? Bit between his teeth, hooves to the four winds, his stallion of a son will gallop full throttle up the slopes he'll have to climb, with no leeway for screwing up those acrobatics without a net that, during the Indian summer days of his writing on the shores of the bay and his dreams of Jacmel, in the light of homelands fashioned by the time of the plantation's white sorrows, his surges of verbal invention will become. A compass stolen from a West Indian buccaneer will serve as his guide along the branch of the sea that incubates his passion somewhere downstream of the maroon's adventures. His partners in this maritime comedy are as likely to be the whirl of cyclones as the spiraling nights of a garden woman, the wings of an airplane, or the wheels of a locomotive. For years at a time, wandering along some goat trail, a donkey's trot, and a purebred's gallop will furnish his writerly roadmap with botanical recipes for creativity. The fantasies of an enchanted gardener will guide his solar eroticism through the carnival of the 20th century's conventional wisdom. A manual for a Swiss clock, a journeyman builder's toolkit, a baptismal font in a Gothic cathedral, a treatise on Soviet witchcraft, and let's not forget the Saint-Étienne Weapons and Bicycles factory catalog, will serve as so many guardrails for his poetic state of mind. Like a nurturing mother, a big mama spool of thread, the singer sewing machine, will send his enchanted kite soaring through the feminine blue skies of history, thrilled to feed its most glorious strands through that singer sewing machine as it stitches the beautiful sheets of a Germano-Haitian marvelous reel among the night terrors of those childhood years, before furnishing with French-styled rhizomes the surges of evening prose that would make the whole world hear the sonata of grief, so specific to the very skin and bones of a poor devil from the Black Republic. Grania Fleury Blanc's eldest daughter, the very Dianiera Font Oriol, that's de Pestro's mother, the very Dianiera Font Oriol who was part of this escapade, aka Popa Singer von Hofmannsthal, goddaughter of General Alfenix Ultimo, by the light of her gift of clairvoyance. I should have said that one of the main characters of this novel is de Pestro's mother, who is prone to being possessed by the Austrian spirit of von Hofmannsthal, who lives inside her singer sewing machine that she uses to support her family of 5 children throughout the novel while she fights off Duvalier. So, hence this. Anywho, by the light of her gift of clairvoyance, along with her rhizomatic identity as Alois Métis, will apply the rotational movements of a Mozart sonata to the powers of his destiny, which is the work of interweaving the mostly tender experiences of life in society. Shuttles, steering wheels, hubs, wheels, pulleys, buckles, discs, windmills, paddles, and steam turbines of pretty ladies will help to trace in his nomad steps the roots of the royal banyan tree that the star of his elderly manhood will need for traversing the fields of tribulations through the deserts and iniquities of a planetary era struggling with the mystical missiles of barbarism. He will have to add all his tribulations, existential reversals, psychological about-faces, along with all he has achieved, to the well-tempered steel of a poetic nomadism tormented by crossbars and sincerities. More than once, Mamma Mia, covered in scars, Dick Denizen, his head full to bursting with real utopia, threatened with the hijacking of his ideals, his fantasies adrift, his poeticizations at risk of death, more than once Dianera Fontoriol's boy will have to unstitch himself from the partisan cesspools of 20th century horror and imposture so to escape the traps of lawless mob mentalities of those who would seek to tamper with the story of his tumultuous journey vita. At each stopover in his marine animals crossings, sorceress state powers, erected along his path like so many defilers of the humanities, will lay traps for him. Both the straight lines and the curves of his life will be caught up in various battles, be it with switchblades or with rockets, on behalf of a little prince of tenderness, compelled in all his innocence and compassion to live in times of civil war, within himself or with his fellow man, facing aggression from ancient dark forces, the sword, religion, and the market, the 3 orders that are at the origin of the shipwrecking of this world. Thank you for listening. That's me and de Pestre when I last visited him. That's him at 97.
Thank you so much, Kayama. I hope that the translation is also coming out as an audiobook that we can listen to. So our final presenter on this first panel today is Michelle Quay, who is lecturer of Persian here at Brown. Thank you.
Okay, is that working? Seems like it's working.
It's working.
Okay, wonderful. Closer the better. Closer the better. Got it. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Okay, wonderful. I'm so excited to be here with you all to talk a little bit about this project and just be in conversation with you. The goal of this project, which is an anthology of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish rhetoric manuals, actually is deeply comparative with the European and Western traditions. So I'm really excited that we have all these representatives to compare with. So this project is a 5-year project funded by the European Research Council, and the principal investigator is actually none other than Rebecca Ruth Golds, who Matthew Reynolds was mentioning yesterday in his panel about prismatic Jane Eyre. She and Keyvan Tahmassebian contributed to that project, and you were talking about Keyvan yesterday, his fantastic photos of the covers of Jane Eyre. So a lot of overlap with what's going on in the conference. And a few other colleagues that I need to mention, in addition to Keyvan, are Nasreen Askari, Christophe de Holster, and Hani Rochouan. As you can imagine, with such a complex trilingual project, you need a huge team in order to accomplish the amount of expertise that's required. And that's really one of the most exciting things about this project. So if I can talk, and this is just a sample for you of what shaped poetry looks like from the medieval period. So you could have different shapes in which you composed your poems. So if I can talk about a little bit about the impetus for the project. So it was twofold impetus. I think Rebecca was particularly inspired by encountering the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, which, as you may know, is a huge tome. It's 3,000 pages. It has 191 articles in it, and only, by my last count, only 4 of those articles are about non-Western traditions or from non-Western critics. And I thought, okay, surely Middle Eastern poetics and literary theory has more to offer than 2% of what's going on in globally. So a big part of this project is sort of questioning the tendency of literary theory to skew European, to skew towards 20th century, while at the same time, as we see here, presenting itself as historically and geographically neutral, right? Everyone else has to hyphenate, everyone else has to specify, but here we have a supposedly a neutral anthology, right? So to rectify this, we've been working on creating this anthology of literary theory from Persian, Turkish, and Arabic. And the other aim of the project was to sort of properly contextualize the multilingualism of this discipline. So it's deeply, deeply multilingual. If you look at the Persian manuals that I'm working on, many of their quotations, their examples that they cite are in Arabic. If you look at the Ottoman ones, they're gonna be trilingual now, right? We're gonna have Arabic, Persian, and Turkish verses in there as examples of what a simile might be, what a metaphor might be. So that level of trilingualism was assumed by these authors, but in today's context, we can't assume that trilingualism. So this is a chance for us to step out of our silos of our language traditions where we feel really comfortable and sort of compare across the different disciplines. So it's quite an ambitious project, but I mean that in the best way possible. And you can see here, if maybe you don't have a lot of context for Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, you can see that the time spans that we're talking about are truly extensive, right? So we're talking 11 centuries of material coming from Arabic. And the reason that we thought this is even possible is that the tradition is really excellent at reproducing itself and really consistent across the terminology. And it's very recursive as a tradition. So although Arabic is kind of our source material, there are little subtle transformations that happen across the centuries, across time. But because of the unity of the field, we were able to sort of approach this. So one thing that I put this here for my Persian students who might care what the sources are, but we can come back for that later. You can see that all the ones I worked on are medieval, so 11th through 13th century. Yeah, so we struggled to keep the technical terms together. So what we ended up doing was creating this enormous and very intimidating looking chart index of our various terms across the languages and how they were being used. And as in these cases, they're quite consistent, but in other cases, we found that there's a lot of sort of subtlety across the different languages, how these terms are being used. So these are all different terms for basically accusing the poets of using filler in their verses, right? So they've added something just to make up the meter or rhyme. And some of them are ugly and some of them are nice or whatever, right? And so just to give you an idea of like what these volumes contain, it is a lot of very detailed literary devices. So you can see here that, maybe you can't see, it's quite small. Here there are at least five different types of similes that Radioni has identified and brought examples for. But it's more than just, the nitty-gritty literary devices. This is a huge branch of a science, we call it actually in Persian, that has different parts, the science of meanings, actually incredible what you were just talking about, Kevin, with the Gehalt and this like concept of raw materials. Like as I have been translating the mani, the meaning as raw materials, it's like the pre-material that comes before the form, before it's finalized into a verse. And in our context, we have very different ideas about what counts as plagiarism. So basically, you're allowed to steal that mani, that raw material. That's fine. You can't steal the form. You can't steal the finalized verse. But it's like competition. So whoever wrote the raw material better in the final form wins, in fact, according to the critics. So yeah, amazing the overlaps that we've already seen. The science of, so yes, usually divided into 3 parts: science of meaning, science of expression is going to incorporate things like how the meaning is expressed, like through simile, through metaphor, allusion, things that we're quite familiar with. And then the science of poetic ornamentation, this is where we get into like the really crazy word games like dots, and it's truly endless the amount of games that you can play in this poetry. So I'm going to give you just a few examples of what was difficult, challenges that we faced, but also one example of what was easy, because we never talk about what was easy about our translations. I'll come back for this. So this particular device, is generally translated as the observance of the similar in my field. That's a traditional translation that perhaps we need to work on. But the concept behind it is quite clear. So I'll just read it out because I know it's quite small. So this is a short quote that Rashiduddin Vatvat has used in his 11th century manual. When the hazelnut of your love closed upon my lips, the weight of loving you cracked my spine like a walnut. Every arrow that flew from your almond-like eye pierced my wounded heart like a nut in a pistachio shell. So very quickly we can see that the nut theme is the point of the device here, where you rack up as many instances from a semantic field as you possibly can, and you get more and more credit for that the more that you can add. And of course, there's many also untranslatable puns going on here as well that they get credit for. So I'll put that in that's what was easy, that's what translated well, was devices like this, where you can see very quickly exactly what's going on. Other things, we had to be a lot more creative. So this is how the metrical system, as in like the prosody, the meter of poetry, is normally diagrammed in the Islamic tradition. And you can see that, we would need this image. So we include this image in our translation, but also not only is the system entirely different, being quantitative, like not stress-based, it also has this very intense tent metaphor going on, like extended metaphor underlying all the description of poetry, right? So every verse is a tent, and every syllable is a peg. And so we had to kind of be creative about how much of that we translated and kept the metaphor, and how much we were like, okay, we're just calling it feet, like we do in English or whatever. So this was one of our big challenges. And I just want to give you a couple examples. This is an example of a poem where the poet has used only letters that don't connect to each other. So again, this is going to be totally illegible for a broader audience. So we need to include pictures, explain. And here we have the opposite, where only letters that connect to each other are being used. And if I have any readers of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish in the audience, they're going to look at that bottom one and be like, what in the world is that? So these are things that we needed to add a lot of explanation for in our translation. And the last thing I want to leave us with to think about is a little bit about audience, and considering the audience for a work like this, which has so many, by necessity, has so many technical terms in it, right? So I don't expect you to read this at all. I just want you to see that, I've highlighted where I put in brackets a technical term, and this is like a draft passage that I feel more happy with for an audience that is coming from like European literatures and might not be familiar with all of our terms. But then I was looking through my drafts last night, and you can see how many technical terms I felt compelled or tempted to include because of the norms of our field, right? So it's kind of expected that you would include more of this so that specialists would know exactly what you're talking about. But given the aims of our project, which is to be more comparative, to invite a Europeanness and Americanness into the audience, I think what we eventually want to do is get rid of as many of these technical terms as we possibly can, because those who are interested in that, they're going to go to the source text and look at it if they need it, right? So this is, but you can feel my like fear under here, right? You can feel, I've even like I've added things, any word I added, I was like, I put it in parentheses. So this is something that as scholars, maybe we're trained in our disciplines, but we need to think about really carefully about how much of this we're really going to use for our particular audience. Okay, I will leave you with the outputs for the project. So this year, it's very exciting. There's a volume coming out with Oxford University Press that my colleagues have edited, and this is like on the critical side, so it's a series of critical articles, and then we're still working on the anthology of translated materials, which will come out eventually, a huge project. But yeah, and thank you all. I wish you all some happy times of reading and rereading, just like this gentleman who's ignoring all his friends pounding on the door outside. Yeah, and I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our presenters for laying out three really fascinating, such different translation projects. It's made me think a little bit about the Mexican writer Cristina Rivera Garza, who talks about the ways that translation unfinishes a text, right? Makes it available to a variety of different readers, which resonates with many of the conversations yesterday. We have about 20 minutes for conversation now. Thank you so much to our presenters for strictly observing the time limit. So we'd like to begin by inviting you to converse amongst yourselves, again, in public, if there are any questions that you'd like to share, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
I have just a small question for Michelle. Could you say more about the thing with the letters that connect and the letters that don't connect, what that was exactly? Does that mean that the poem is being determined by the typographical form of the letters?
Yeah, exactly. It's on. So Persian, Arabic, Turkish, as written in the Perso-Arabic script, is a naturally cursive language. So like most of the letters want to connect, but there's a certain number of letters that just by chance you don't connect them. So this poet has picked to use only those letters, like Z and U or whatever, that don't connect, just to create this image of, it looks odd. It looks very odd to you when you see it. And that's like, it's like an extra form of putting constraints on yourself, like kind of a Eulipian style.
Like
yes,
yeah.
yes, exactly. So it's a form of playing with extra constraints, basically. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll ask a question about the Creole. I'm a little bit curious. So, can you say anything about the sort of literary tradition that that he's drawing on? Is it a Creole sort of institution, or is it more cosmopolitan than that?
Yeah, it's more cosmopolitan and where there is kind of a Creole influence that is felt in the text, it's very deliberate. So he, as I said, he was 19 when he left Haiti and then had a kind of long and robust Francophone and European education. So where he kind of grew up as a writer was much later, so outside of the Creole environment. So his implication of Creole feels often more stylistic, not in a superficial way, but it is stylistic in its presentation. So syntactically, these kinds of rhythmic repetitions and these spiralings are what you would actually hear as a child from local elders who tell stories. But he's far removed from that when he writes Pupa Singer in 2001, right? So a full half a century since he's left Haiti. And so in translating the text, where he chose to either Creolize through the style or to leave Creole words in their original form. I did the same because it was so performative. It didn't want to be, he didn't want it to be translated. He wanted it to be this moment of, here's a different thing that I'm doing so I can suck you into a different world space. So the literary traditions he's drawing on are really European, frankly, with this infusion of the idiosyncrasies of the Haitian worldview.
And so did you annotate the Creole terms then? Or?
You know, I also hewed close to what he was doing there. So he provided, I think, at the end of the day, maybe like 4 footnotes for some terms. It was the only 4 footnotes I included as well.
I see.
There is a lengthy introduction where I cheat and explain some of the more opaque elements of the translation that felt very freeing. So I could, for the interested reader, they really could get to the nitty gritty of what's going on. But the text itself, I wanted to keep it as disruptive, at once disruptive and fluid as he tried to do. Yeah.
Thanks.
I wonder if I could ask you, Ola, a question about audiences. I was very struck by the multiplicity of audiences. And obviously, Kayama, this is something that you're playing with as well in your translation, but when you're talking to us about l'audience and the assumed audiences, right? With this, I was really struck in Susan's rendering, how interesting it is that Benjamin is writing about Goethe for a Soviet audience, right? But is also writing back to Hugo von Hofmannsthal, right, to comment on this writing. So there's already a bifurcated audience. In the case of De Pest, this seems to be built in, right? On the one hand, a very local audience that's capable of actually recognizing very specific historical terms and modulations, right? Linguistic modulations, but at the same time, I'm assuming he is trying to speak to the multiple audiences that he's visited, right? That he wants this text to travel. And then, Michelle, in your case, you're precisely grappling with this, right? That you have something that is absolutely attentive to the local, that you're now trying to open up to multiple audiences. So I wonder if any of you would like to comment a little bit more on this question of an audience that's directed, or a translation that's directed to multiple audiences at once, or an original.
I can start just to follow up on what I was saying before. And thank you. That's a really beautiful question. I think you're right that all of us are grappling with that matter of audience, either directly or indirectly. I will say, for De Pestre, it's a phenomenon that's common to most Haitian writers, which is the fact that you're inevitably writing for an external audience. Up until the 1980s, I think the literacy rate in Haiti was about 85%. So whether you're writing in French or in Creole, you are, for the most part, gesturing toward the Francophone, gesturing outside of the local context. However, when De Pestre was part of this revolution, again, a longer story, he became a leading figure because he had published a volume of poetry in Haiti at the age of 19 in 1945, where many of the poems were then read out loud. And this is how he kind of got some notoriety and some celebrity that enabled him to help launch this revolution. And so I think very much, and why I wanted to read was to say that, yes, it's a French publishing house, he's hoping for French readers. He's hoping to give this window onto Haiti to a wider audience. But if you're Haitian and you hear this story, you're in the world. It's a world you know. The people who have these absurd names are variations on names from Haitian history that you'll recognize. There's like this form of inclusion of a local audience that in most instances is left out of the literary sphere, as well as, in some ways, a kind of refusal to a Francophone reader, as saying, like, there's stuff that you're not going to get, and I'm doing that to you on purpose, so you can feel disturbed.
I would say about my piece that, Benjamin in some ways was at a disadvantage because he didn't really know his Soviet audience very well. And that was what the little fight he had with his friend Asya Lakas was about. One of the things she said was, you don't know how things are done here. This is while he was in Moscow. And in another piece, he says that one of the conditions for popularization is knowing one's audience. So he himself was somewhat handicapped, I think, in not really knowing his audience and not knowing Russian. So it's sort of like a question whether there was any audience at all.
Can I add something to that? So one of the things that this translation project revealed to us, I think that we didn't know when we started, is that if you trace Goethe through Benjamin's writings, as it cuts across all of these writings, one of the things that's revealed is this increasing question of audience for Benjamin. So at the beginning of his career, when he's in the late teens and when he writes the essay on the elective affinities, he's writing for like a group of 5 or 6 friends. You know, that's his audience, if it maybe even just for himself, perhaps. But for a variety of reasons, eventually he has to start thinking about his audience because, of course, he's not successful in his academic career, and so he has to write on commission starting in the late 20s. And that there's a confluence between that personal situation for Benjamin, professional situation, and Goethe at the time, because 1932 was the anniversary of Goethe's death. And, you know, that anniversary was probably for Germans, they have sort of equivalent maybe of like the bicentennial of the French Revolution or our 250th anniversary of the American Revolution coming, you know, with all of the negative and positive aspects of that, because of course in 1933 the Nazis take power. And all of the Goethe stuff gets wound up together with this. And Benjamin was planning to write a book about Goethe. And this is another thing that I think that became very clear to us, that there was a discussions with Insel Verlag to publish a book, but they never issued the contract and he never finished it. And of course, it was a very chaotic period. So it's interesting in his work that as he, you can trace, if you follow Goethe, this shift from, for example, the essay on elective affinities is very esoteric, you know, again, for a very small audience. He had a great deal of difficulty getting it published. Thanks to Hugo von Hofmannsthal, it did get published. Whereas the later piece, which did not get translated into Russian, but now that Susan has produced an English translation of, was very aware of trying to influence the political discussion around you know, basically materialism, historical materialism, which Benjamin had, you know, become much more, you know, engaged politically during this time. And so his concern for audience was parallel to the more political turn that his writings take in the late 20s and 30s. And it's hard to see that clearly until when you read the Goethe pieces, you can see it. It's very clear. And that was one of the things I thought was interesting. Translation project like this, where you select the writings and you try to follow them, and you know, reveals things that I think would be difficult to see even in the German edition, which is just chronological, you know.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that in some ways a series of writings by a particular author on another author, right, themselves constitute a series of translations of the ideas. And also a tracing of something that you mentioned, Kevin, that I thought was fascinating, the impossibility of composing a materialist portrait in the present tense, right, that you need, and this is something that Benjamin himself, I think, says of Baudelaire, that in order to understand Baudelaire, we also need to understand the readings of Baudelaire. So we need to trace the history of those readings, which again is part of the tracing of different translations that Matthew, for instance, was talking about yesterday with prismatic translation. I think on that point, we should open this up to questions from the audience. So,
Wait,
yes.
okay.
Michelle.
We have a microphone.
Michelle, to respond to your question
I'm
of
sorry,
audience.
Michelle. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, just to respond briefly about audience. In the case of our multilingual anthology of literary theory from the Middle East, I don't think we were so naive as to imagine that it's going to have a hugely broad readership, but perhaps we were reaching towards people interested in literary theory from the European and Western tradition. So that was kind of our maximum that we were aiming for. And I think what's really helpful is creating a sort of sophisticated set of paratextual materials around the book. So Rebecca is working on this like very fantastic introduction for the volume, which will provide a lot of context. And in my discussion a little bit about the technical terms, I probably touched on it, but I think we need to be less afraid of using 10 words in English where 1 word was used in the Persian, right? Like we might need that. And then another thing we've been trying to do is draw connections to source material that feels familiar to Western readers as much as possible. So the Arabic tradition, and really the whole tradition, is deeply influenced by Aristotle and Greek philosophy. And the connections are so deep that some of the theorists you literally cannot read without a thorough knowledge of Aristotle's Poetics, and you need to know exactly how it came through Greek into Arabic in order to know, oh, he's saying logos here, right? Like this is actually Aristotelian term. So we reach for those connections wherever we can and amplify them to connect to a different audience.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So I think we had a question here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question for Kaya McLaughlin. In your first book, Haiti Unbound, a spiralist challenge to the post-colonial canon, published in 2010, I was actually wondering how you would relate your scholarly interventions to your scholarly translation. Does the first one influence the second practice? Does your spiralist background inform your translation practice? How do you conceive of both in conversation? Yes, that's my question.
Thank you, Alicia, for the question. So I started translating just about 10 years ago, well after I had been a professor, researcher, scholar, teacher, all the things. And so I would actually say that, well, it sounds so cheesy in some ways, but translating has made me a better scholar. I think being a scholar has certainly helped with translations in ways that are probably obvious to most people, right? Just giving context and clarity around biographical and historical realities that inform a text. But I think when I started translating, it was very organic. It was twofold. One, I realized my first translation was a commission. Someone had asked me, based on Haiti Unbound, to translate Franck Etienne's first novel. When I did the translation, I realized how much I had missed in my book in analyzing the novel. I was so frustrated that I hadn't slowed down enough. And I thought I had, right? As a scholar, you really do think you're slowing down enough. But the translating of his work just took me to a different level of engagement. And so I very intentionally think through translation as I work on other works of literature like De Pestro's Corpus. And then the other reason that I had started translating after Haiti Unbound was because the authors, and is often my want, the authors that I work on were so little known by my students, many of whom were Haitian American, but whom, because of the vicissitudes of Haiti's history, had not grown up speaking French, had no access to this extraordinary patrimony, and only had access to thinking about Haiti through the lens of American racism, essentially. Haiti as need, Haiti as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, but not Haiti as one of the richest artistic nations in the world, period. So I had started translating so that I could teach these novels to students who didn't read in French, after realizing how obscure Haiti Unbound would be if people couldn't access the primary corpus. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. My question will be for Michelle. Like from my tiny education in Arabic and Ottoman Turkish rhetoric, I barely remember that what makes a good writing, a very good writing, is writing in accordance with the requirements of the context or the situation, like muqtazai hal, from taking it from fasih to bali, right? So it was always striking for me to take context or this audience matter as a literary standard. So could you a little bit elaborate on this standard, how can we think about this context as a literary standard?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great question. The first thing to sort of point out is that in this tradition of literary criticism is deeply evaluative. It is not afraid to tell you that is bad poetry. And it will bring you examples and say, this is bad because they tried to force 8 puns in here and they're all terrible, right? So, and it's not just for fun that these things are being evaluated, right? So if in this context, the poet is in fact a propagandist, right? He's a form of, he's created these poems, and generally they're commissioned by a certain patron, a certain ruler, right, for a certain reason. They're getting paid to produce these poems, right? They're not just for fun, most of them. So if that's the case, if you're paying good money for these works of propaganda, right, we need to be able to evaluate them properly and decide if your money was worth it or not, right? So one of the things that as related to the audience part of your question is actually the genre, right? So inside that science of meanings that I was talking about, there's this very detailed explanation of how a poet can change one of those raw materials that's an unfinished verse, right? You can change it into a love poetry theme. You can change it into a praise theme of a king. You can change it into a satire, which is now, you know, making fun of the ruler, making fun of the king. You might unintentionally mock your patron by being overly effuse, right? And it seems sarcastic at a certain point. So the critics are quite detailed about this and all these different genres and how you need to keep in mind who, you know, your final audience is. Your final audience is really the patron and the critics who are going to tell the patron if your poetry was worth it or not. So.
I think we have time for one more question, if nothing.
Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed the panel. I have my remark is it's mainly for Michelle again, actually, but I just wanted to speak up on behalf of the kind of technical terms that you're thinking of cutting out. I mean, this is kind of continuous with some of the discussion that's been already. So I think so in the chapter that Kevin and Rebecca wrote in the Prismatic Jane Eyre project, there's lots of Persian in there, which and I love that about it. And one of my ambitions for the book was to make the pages as multilingual as possible. And the reason for that is that they're making an argument about genre and kinds of narrative and things like that, that, you know, the English, if you just stuck it all in English, it wouldn't be right. And even though now, I mean, I can't remember those words, the experience of reading that chapter very much for me is saying, okay, I have to stretch to try to reorganize my categories so that I'm understanding something that, and I just think it's a really important thing for all of us, you know, as English is increasingly the meta language of all academic discussion. We need to kind of really stretch the meta. It's like what's happened in the field of translation, isn't it? Really, over the last 10 or 20 years, that pushing against the expectation that everything has to be kind of fluent and in standard English, etc., and opening up spaces for more inventive work. I think that's a real challenge for all of us, really, to kind of open up more plural linguistic spaces in academic discourse so that we can develop a more kind of welcoming and varied meta-language, isn't it? So I mean, I'm really looking forward to the publications from this project, to come out, because I want to kind of, you know, learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think that the audience should absolutely be asked to stretch, but there's a stretching and then there's snapping the rubber band, right?
Sure.
So like with the passages, like of course the technical terms in the table of contents that are the main term, we absolutely have to keep those, right? Those are what are connecting us across the language, across the discipline. But you know, in like random paragraphs, it's really just a habit that comes from our field, right? So I think the reason I'm saying this is because we have this like very Orientalist discipline behind us, which is telling us that our translations are just a crib, that they're just a bridge to the source and they're not worth anything in their own right. So because we have that back hundreds of years of scholarship in the back of our heads, right? We're trying to say, no, like the translation has a value, the translation should be readable. Like many of these translations are literally unreadable if you don't read Persian. So yeah, there's no way I'm gonna advocate for getting rid of, you know, a lot of our technical terms, but there's gotta be some kind of limit.
Can I just say, I find that very interesting what you've just said about our academic or critical meta language, because as you were saying that, I was thinking, well, I have a fair amount of German because of the fact that German does participate so robustly in the construction of theory in the academy, right? There are words that we do all know in German because of that. How likely is it that Creole terms are going to make it there? Sure. That Persian terms are right? We have to. I think your point is well taken. That only with a great deal of stretching, but necessary stretching, can we admit other language traditions into our epistemologies, right? Into the way that we conceive of any of the work that we do, be it in the United States or in the North Atlantic more broadly. Can we incorporate post-colonial and South languages and ways of thinking into our own ways of thinking? Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much to our presenters for a really wonderful panel to start us off today. Our next panel will be on multilingualism beginning at 10:30 in the same room, so thank you very much.
Thank you.